resurrecting the past. Scanning timelines. File 2042, corrupted. File 1347, blacklisted. The past is too heavy. Files damaged. Increasing frequency. Forcing early access. Locking coordinates. Pacific sector. Initiating.
On the morning of a deceptively radiant day, the Acheron, a nuclear giant of the Leviathan class, breached the dark, bruised surface of the ocean. She was not a beautiful vessel. She was a brutalist monument of survival, a slab of matte black titanium and carbon steel scarred by deep-sea trenches and forgotten naval skirmishes. A sharp northern wind swept across the deck, chilling the corroded exterior and the reinforced double hull until the very skeleton of the ship seemed to groan in a low, resonant agony. It sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. Yet behind the meter-thick iron walls, the air was charged with a different frequency. It was not the silence of the grave, but the razor-sharp kinetic tension of a predator calculating its strike. The crew, 84 souls bound by strict operational protocols, moved with a rhythmic mechanical discipline. There was no casual chatter, no nervous pacing. In the command center, bathed in the glow of tactical displays, Captain Elias Thorne watched the descent monitors. In his eyes there was no void of nullity. Instead, a fierce, burning resolve flickered, cold and precise. They were not sinking to die. They were diving to confront the source of an anomaly that had haunted their tactical grid and his reality like a phantom for 2 decades. "Main ballast tanks flooding," reported Vance, the first officer, his voice a flat baritone cutting through the hum of the twin nuclear reactors. "Pressure equalizing, commencing dive protocol." As the massive external hatches hissed shut, locking with a series of concussive thuds that vibrated through the floor plates, they severed all ties with the world of light. The Acheron began its true journey. This was a mission of reclamation, a desperate, blind hand reaching into the crushing throat of the world to find what had been stolen. The steel was no longer just groaning. It had braced itself for an environment that actively sought to crush it into a singularity. The dive began not with a splash, but with a heavy, rhythmic surrender to the deep. As the Acheron slipped beneath the waves, the vibrant blues of the morning were instantly swallowed by a cold, suffocating gray. Within minutes, they passed the Epipelagic Zone. The sunlight above faded from gold to pale green and finally to a bruised, impenetrable black. Inside, the primary lighting shifted to the dull red glow of the emergency consoles, designed to preserve the crew's night vision and lower power consumption. The crimson light reflected off the sweat-streaked, hollowed faces of the technicians. No one spoke unless explicitly required by the manual. In this hollowed-out iron tomb, words were a luxury they could no longer afford. Sound itself was a liability when listening for the whispers of the abyss. At 3,000 meters, the midnight zone, the ocean began to actively test the mathematical limits of the reinforced iron. The pressure outside was now roughly 300 atmospheres. The hull didn't just groan anymore. It whispered. It was a metallic, rasping sound, the friction of titanium plates compressing by fractions of a millimeter, echoing through the narrow corridors like the ragged breath of a dying god. Every bolt, every weld, and every bulkhead screamed under a weight of water that defied human comprehension. Condensation began to form on the interior walls, weeping like cold sweat down the conduits. But Captain Thorne remained motionless, his posture rigidly locked, his gaze fixed on the primary sonar's empty, sweeping arm. The rhythmic ping, ping, was the only heartbeat the Acheron had left. He wasn't looking for biological life. Whales and giant squids did not dive this deep. They were now intruders in a Benthic kingdom that had forgotten the sun eons ago, crawling deeper into the Mariana-Class trench to reclaim a truth that humanity had deliberately buried. Thorne stood like a statue carved from the same rusted, unforgiving iron as his ship. His uniform was immaculate but threadbare, a relic of the Great War. It was a time he remembered with hyper-lucid clarity, when the sky was choked by the ash of coal-fired dreadnoughts, when the seas literally burned red with the ignited oil of fallen empires, and when humanity nearly suffocated itself in the name of global sovereignty. Elias had been the undeniable pride of the Pacific Fleet. He was a tactician who could navigate a crippled submarine through an active acoustic minefield by the mere sound of the thermal currents. He had turned down every promotion to admiral, every ribbon, and every chance to sit in a comfortable chair in a surface command center. To him, stars on a shoulder were just high-visibility targets for the enemy's snipers. He preferred the cold, absolute anonymity of the deep. But the war had left him with more than just shrapnel scars and localized hearing loss. It had left him with a psychological thirst that no ocean could quench. For 20 years, he had tried to drown the auditory hallucinations of his fallen crew in cheap synthetic whiskey, searching for a chemical peace that only a bottle could provide. He was known among the high command as a functional alcoholic, yet even in his darkest, most destructive benders, his hands never shook. His mind remained a steel trap. He remembered every navigation coordinate he had ever plotted, every pressure gauge reading from vessels long destroyed, and most painfully, the exact spectral frequency of a voice he hadn't heard since the world burned. Her name was Clara. She had been the chief engineer on the Vanguard, an experimental scout vessel that vanished without a distress signal during the final, catastrophic siege of the Pacific Front. Theirs was an impossible, unsanctioned connection, born in the cramped, oil-slicked, 100-degree engine rooms of training vessels, and sustained by whispered coded promises over heavily encrypted radio channels during combat patrols. When her ship was quietly claimed by the abyss, erased from the tactical boards in a matter of seconds, Elias didn't mourn in the traditional sense. He didn't hold a memorial. He calculated. He waited. He knew the Great War didn't end with a signed treaty on a battleship deck. The violence had just moved deeper, out of sight of the civilian populations. Now, as the Acheron groaned at 6,000 meters, entering the Hadalpelagic Zone, Elias wasn't just chasing a classified signal. He was chasing a ghost that stubbornly refused to stay silent. The whiskey flask in his pocket was full, but untouched. The chemical hunger was gone, replaced by a cold, sober obsession to find the one soul the ocean had stolen but couldn't completely destroy. Passing 7,000 meters, Vance announced, wiping a bead of condensation from his brow. Structural integrity at 92%. Microfractures detected in the outer ablative armor, but the inner pressure hull is holding. Reactor core temperatures nominal. Maintain descent, Elias replied, his voice barely above a whisper yet carrying across the entire bridge. Cut active sonar. Switch to passive listening only. If it's down there, I don't want it knowing we're knocking on the door until we kick it in. Aye, Captain. Passive sonar only. Going silent. The ping ceased. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was physical, a heavy blanket of dread that settled over the crew. At 8,000 meters, the silence of the Acheron was absolute. Then it was shattered. It wasn't the rhythmic beating of a geothermal vent or the biological clicking of a deep-sea anomaly. It was a fragment of an electronic transmission. It crackled through the salt-eroded, high-fidelity speakers of the bridge, cutting through the acoustic dampeners like a scalpel. Static. White noise. Then a single, agonizingly distorted intake of breath. Elias. The frequency was impossible. Radio waves could not physically travel through 8 kilometers of dense, ionized saltwater. VLF, very low frequency communication, required massive trailing antennae and only allowed for Morse code, not high-resolution human voice data. The bridge crew froze. The helmsman's hands locked on the yoke. Vance turned slowly, his eyes wide, exchanging glances of pure, unfiltered terror with the navigation officers. The whiskey bottle in Elias' pocket suddenly felt like a block of ice against his thigh, but his face remained a mask of stone. He didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. He reached for the sonar control dials, his fingers moving with a terrifying, practiced calm. "Petrov," Elias addressed the sonar operator, whose hands were shaking violently over the spectral analyzer. "Isolate that frequency. Run it through the historical database." "Sir, the medium. It's not radio," Petrov stammered, his eyes darting frantically across the cascading waterfalls of green data on his screen. "It's acoustic. It's being transmitted through the water itself, riding a thermal layer. But the modulation, it's mimicking a radio broadcast." "Captain," Vance interrupted, staring at the primary depth gauge. "Contact. Direct spatial anomaly directly below us. Depth 9,000 meters. Dead center of the trench floor." Elias activated the active sonar himself. A single, powerful ping was fired into the darkness beneath them. The agonizing seconds stretched as they waited for the return echo. Elias stared at the sweeping green light of the monitor. A massive, geometric silhouette was beginning to form on the digital representation of the ocean floor. It wasn't a geographical formation. It had hard angles, a conning tower, and the distinct displacement signature of a man-made object. "Identify," Elias commanded, his voice completely devoid of emotion, a cold, mechanical order. Petrov's hands hovered over the console. He ran the acoustic signature, the sonar bounce, and the magnetic distortion through the military database once. The system flashed red. He ran it a second time, bypassing the safety protocols. The color drained from Petrov's face entirely, leaving him looking like a corpse under the red emergency lights. "Sir, the acoustic signature, the titanium mass, the reactor shielding displacement, it matches." "Matches what, Petrov? Speak clearly." The operator looked up. The dread in his eyes was heavier than the 9 kilometers of ocean crushing down on their roof. "Us, Captain, the signature is an exact 1-to-1 match. It's the Acheron." Elias stared at the green light. The massive shadow resting in the deep didn't move. It emitted no power signature. It was completely dead, yet it was waiting. "Full stop," Elias whispered into the darkness. "Hold depth." Beneath them, their own grave was waiting to be opened.
Ripping the void. Let's see if there's a God waiting. Remnant